Check, check. Hey. Mine's on. Hey, we're going to start, I think.
Yo. Okay. Beautiful. Thank you so much.
If you want to move closer, great. If you don't want to, that's okay. But it's a smaller group than the last one.
So, good morning.
Good morning.
Yeah. I'm glad you all are here. I'm Charles Preston. I currently do community engagement for a nonprofit newsroom called Injustice Watch. Shout out to you. Injustice Watch, we are basically an investigative reporting outlet that covers the Cook County court system and intersections of it. We put out a judicial voting guide every time there's a election when it comes to judges. So go to injusticewatch.org and look at that. I'll give you more about myself later. I'm 35, a Taurus. But I'll give you more about myself later, but Ben is way more accomplished than me, so Ben, introduce yourself.
You guys need to put out a voting guide for school board now. That's where we are.
It's a lot of work.
It's a lot of work. I'm Ben Austen. I'm a journalist from here in Chicago. My most recent book is called Correction, Parole, Prison, and the Possibility of Change. I had another book before that about Cabrini-Green and really about cities and other things. Come on. We're connecting here. You're into this. You're into this already. Called High Risers. I do podcasts also and write for newspapers and the New York Times and other things. But we're here to talk about kind of what was being talked about already and what we're all probably always talking about, which is this tough on crime narrative.
Yeah, basically we want to explore the tough on crime narrative and develop strategies to shape and shift conversations to aid advocacy efforts, right? We want people free, and how do we get people free during a climate where tough on crime is like overly emphasized, right? So let's start.
Yeah, so I mean, this is something that all of us could talk about. You know, when we think about sort of how these stories pervade our culture. And so for us, we're going to have a conversation up here. And actually, Charles and I, this is how Chicago works in a lot of ways. We move in the same circles, but this is the first day we're actually meeting in person, which is really cool. And so this conversation is us also getting to know one another. But all of us could talk about this from our own experiences. And so we'll start by just talking about our own work. And Charles, why don't you start? In your own work, how do you see the power of these tough on crime stories?
So like working with Injustice Watch, I'm a community engagement manager for Injustice Watch. I don't write the articles. What the community engagement manager do is like we seek out organizations, different stakeholders, try to build up a relationship and a rapport, because so often journalism tends to parachute into communities, extract stories, and not really have a relationship with said people that they're reporting on. Like if they're doing a story about folks who've been incarcerated or formerly incarcerated, they don't have a relationship with those communities that are impacted by incarceration the most. And so like my job is basically to be that bridge, build relationships, and get to know people. And that comes from my organizing background. When I used to organize, I worked for the Black Star Project, and I also was a activist member of BYP 100 around 2015, 2016, and we did a lot of efforts in terms of the BLM movement, highlighting the case of Rekia Boyd, Laquan McDonald, and staging different protests. And so how do I see the tough on crime narrative in my work? It is an antagonism. It is, well, especially like when it comes to the courts, we see people inherently deemed as criminal, walking into courtrooms and having to basically fight for their lives. We see in activism, I saw how uncritical, non-critical that people are when it comes to policing, and how protest is inherently criminalized before we even did any type of civil disobedience, and directly tried to confront the law. So I think it comes up in a lot of instances. What about you?
Yeah. I want to later on. I want to come back to that idea of protest and how it's sort of undercut a lot of protest of the last several years. I'd say in my own work, Charles, I wrote this book about the parole system, and less about getting out on parole, which is what we were talking about in the last session, but actually parole hearings. And to think about a system of parole which should be like kind of logical in a way, that if prisons are called correctional institutions and they're about corrections in theory, then there's a mechanism to assess people later on. Like the theory is that a judge at trial could never know who someone would be in a few years. So if a prison is really about rehabilitation, a parole system, a board later on in 10 years or so, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, are better suited to see who that person would be and when they're ready to return to free society. And I'll say that the way that I see these narratives, just really shortly, that we have a parole system that isn't about release, that is attacked at the very idea of a second chance being like anathema to our culture, right? I mean, so that these, letting anyone out becomes, something you could attack and that's disturbing in some way. And parole boards in Illinois and across the country, when they deny somebody, they usually say some variation of the same language, which is to parole this person would deprecate the seriousness of the offense and disrespect the law. And so when you think about those terms, those words, it's a total paradox, because a crime by its very definition disrespects the law, and it doesn't change over time. Something like a murder is always a murder. So it becomes a trap just to keep people inside. And so that a system set up to reassess individuals and to think when they could return would be perverted to just keep people inside. And so that's certainly, a way that I see it.
Yeah, something that's coming to mind, because you said let's talk about protests, but you say how the tough on crime narratives basically attack parole. Yeah. Right? They attack people vying for freedom, and I see that as a inherent relationship with protests and fights for freedom and whatnot, and even how old this punitive system is. And I want to talk about the origins of the tough on crime, because once you said that, I fancy myself as kind of like a historian. We have laws that are direct responses to protests in terms of inherently deeming people criminals. So in the 1850 Fugitive Slave Acts, in response to the Underground Railroad, people vying for freedom, and next thing you know, they're deeply criminalized in search for freedom, just like today with parole. So can you tell us more about the origins of the tough on crime contemporary today?
Yeah, it's a great way to think about this, and I was thinking about it even in the last session that, we're a country that has always been, deeply racist, deeply punitive, and unfair. And you can say that, and there's still ebbs and flows of when this narrative is more dominant or less so. And that's also really important to think about, all right? And so, we, in the 1960s, even under President Johnson, so we have really a war on poverty going on, and there's an inverse to today of how much funds are going, say, to social safety net programs versus policing and prison programs. And that's just a fact. That's where we were investing our resources. And under Johnson, he starts to talk about a war on crime, and then it gets taken up by the Republicans that follow him. And we see a real backlash against progressive movements. And so Nixon, who follows him, talks about a war on drugs and a war on crime and stoking fears of race as well. And that's, and the undercutting of social safety net programs happens at the same time. And really a kind of rhetoric that is twinned and attached, and both racialized in a lot of ways, and both at young people who are protesters and black people, and both are a threat to society. And so you're able to ramp up tough on crime laws at the same time that you're able to deplete social safety net programs, and they work hand in hand. And then you think of how that develops over time, that this becomes the language of someone being soft on crime and being tarred if you're a politician, and the language of that we need tougher laws, and that these start to expand in many ways after that. It's really phenomenal to think about, and painful to think about, the shifts in the country. There's a moment in the 1970s when there's a prison rights movement, and it's really robust and energetic. And the country is incredibly aware of what's going on in prisons for a certain moment. And it happens to be right at the moment when there's an enormous backlash against just those things, and we get sort of the start of mass incarceration. And it feels like an echo of something of our present, of the last 5 years, the last 4 years.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, the response to progressive movements, right? I think about the media's role in that response, like how they typically categorize or describe protests, how they typically the narratives of the pro-cop narratives in these moments, how riots, quote-unquote riots or uprisings are being described, and kind of like setting the table for incarceration, for mass incarceration. And I think one of the things we really need to dive deep into while sitting on this panel is the role media plays.
I would even say, I went and looked at all those old kind of movies and TV shows, and we've always had, cop shows, and we've always had
the
westerns. But there's, starting around the same time that I'm talking about, there's a kind of revenge fantasy movie that becomes really popular, like the Clint Eastwood cop movie, or the Charles Bronson revenge fantasy movie, which then becomes like the Liam Neeson movie, which has been done 100 times. But really, what those stories are about vigilantism, and that crime is so bad and such monsters that we should be able to kill them.
Right.
And it justifies any response of the toughest sort of on crime punishment, which is just going out and lynching somebody essentially, or killing everybody. And that we're now we're all sort of accept that as kind of like a discourse that we're can be kind of excited about, of dwelling inside these stories.
Yeah, punitive ideology. So Clint Eastwood is no different from anybody that tries to stand their ground when they see a black person in a hoodie walking around. So I think what is pervasive, because I feel like tough on crime is the air that we breathe right now. Indicting people, looking at people as inherently criminal, and that crime is more of a moral failure than something that is created by the system, created by poverty, created by, or actually needed by the system in a lot of ways, in terms of private and public interest. And so, I want us to kind of talk about deterrence theory. Can you explain that for folks, and what does that mean for folks? But also, can you explain the time that we're in, and how did we get from those late '60s progressive movements and the antagonism that came from them to now, to the narratives that we're talking about now?
Yeah, it's interesting. The deterrence theory was something that was really pushed a lot for reasons to expand punitive measures. This is in the 70s. And if you think about what deterrence is, in a very simple way, if deterrence worked, we would be the safest society ever in the history of the world, right? We've done the experiment of both expanding punishments and punishing more people. And we know that there's no relationship, or there hasn't been one, between locking more people up and how the ebbs and flows of crime. You said the thing about the crime as a personal moral failure, which also becomes part of the story that we all believe in some way, we've accepted. Mm-hmm. And that's certainly, as even Democrats say in the 90s are we're going to turn our back on social safety net programs, the same thing is happening. Yeah, I mean, you made me think about one thing, which is in my own work, like when you talk about how pervasive this is, so I'm sitting at parole hearings, and parole hearings are fascinating for a bunch of reasons, but one of them is it's like a storytelling contest, and the stakes are super high, right? Somebody is trying to tell a story to get out of prison. Like, wow, like your sentence can end if you could tell a good enough story. And, there are all kinds of things that are going on, different kinds of stories, the stories of victims, the stories of remorse, how I've spent my time in prison, which in many ways should be the biggest story and the most important one, right? Like, have you been productive? How have you changed? But the story that is always the most dominant is the story of the crime. It doesn't matter how long it happened, how long ago. That story is there in a way and present in the room, and it feels like, and when you hear it in a lot of ways, and I'm guilty of just sitting there and hearing it, it feels like it just happened. Because somebody tells a story of a crime, and you don't think of it as being in the past, you start reacting to the violence right there. And what parole board members end up doing is doing the work of like a sentencing judge. That they want to react, they're still reacting to the crime and punishing the crime over and over again. And so it doesn't matter if it's 50 years. I mean, Khalif Johnny Veal is here, who I wrote about, and I went to his hearings. And his crime was literally 51 years ago, the crime that he was convicted of. He was innocent of it. But the language at his hearings would always be, we're back in that moment. You're like caught in a time warp. And I think that, to me, embodied just like how powerful these narratives are. Like we want to punish the same thing which are already punished. All that time that has passed doesn't even matter. It's like it disappears, and we're still like viscerally want to do something to react to this, to punish it.
Yeah, and of course that ties into my work, because when I think about media, and I think about how careful we have to be with people's stories and not to continuously like criminalize them and hold them to that one time that they made a mistake. I implore writers, journalists to think about, what are the events that led to that moment? And we're not talking about just that moment, but like consider this person's family, consider this person's community, consider this person's worldview, consider this person's. We don't tell enough stories that are deep, and what happens is that it's very easier to create single narratives about people.
Yeah.
And mainstream media is totally at fault for this. Social media, this is like constant, and we find ourselves on the defensive in terms of like trying to fight punitive ideologies, when it's simple. It's like lock them up. That is the main that is the main sentiment of most reporting, really.
Yeah,
and it contributes to it as well. And then not only that, is that they are very defensive of any reporting that is critical of the systems who are punitive. So at Injustice Watch all the time, we have to deal with lawsuits from law enforcement agencies because we dare to be critical of police reports. We dare to tell full stories that doesn't make the system or law enforcement agencies look good. When you talk about, Clint Eastwood in those movies, he was the good guy going around killing folks, And in our work, we even had like a project called In Plain View, where we exposed the social media posts of police officers. And a lot of them were in hidden Facebook groups, community groups, talking about who they arrested. There were parole officers talking about the people incarcerated, and you can see how they view these people as non-human, as that they deserve to be here, and that they're inherently criminal, therefore I can treat them any type of way.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until our reporting that we exposed, that this was exposed, and then all of a sudden, you had governors and different politicians saying, oh, now police, they need social media policy to control, what they say out of online and whatnot. But before then, there was none, because they had the freedom to say what they want and what they like, being the law. So.
Yeah, Charles, I'm glad you said that, because that sense of like that monster narrative, like none of this works unless, when you think about tough on crime, there's someone who has become an abstraction in many ways.
Yeah.
And, I'm just sort of taking it back to these like parole hearings, not imagining the person at the age when they committed the crime, which is a fantasy because that doesn't exist anymore, is sort of stuck there, is refusing to see a person in the present, is refusing to see really a human being, and is still sort of caught up in these ideas of like fear. And you're also talking about, when you're talking about the media, like the limitations of our sense of empathy and the limitations of our sense of mercy. Really often stop with stories of innocence or low-level drug crimes, but we don't have a solution, or we refuse to think about violent crimes and how to respond to them with sort of more rational means. And then you're also saying, what we're talking about here, as we all know, have real-world consequences.
Right.
And so we already said this in a way, but this is the thing that fuels mass incarceration. And mass incarceration is real. Like in the 1970s, at this moment we were talking about, we have 200,000 people in prison across the country, every state prison and the federal prison, okay? Today we have well over 1 million. We have 200,000 people in prison today who have life sentences or de facto life sentences, so the same number as the entire prison population. It's crazy. Like, that has changed. And as you said, mass incarceration sort of followed a pretty simple formula. You lock people up for more offenses, rather than alternatives, for longer periods of time with fewer opportunities for release. That's how you build up and build up and build up.
Yeah.
And I'll just say one other thing, and I want to throw it back to you to think about consequences, but parole, as many people know, I think was even brought up in the last session, in this state it was eliminated in 1978. And so people sentenced before 1978 still come up for parole. And that happened in 15 other states and the federal system. And the truth is that all across the country we curtailed parole. Far fewer people come before parole boards because so many offenses were said, this is no longer eligible for parole. And that actually emerged initially from people inside prison who were like, we need to get rid of the parole system. That part of the prisoner rights movement in the 70s, they were saying, this is an unfair system. I don't trust these people on the board. If they're the ones in control of me ever getting out of here, they're just going to keep me here forever. This system is racist, it's arbitrary, there aren't checks on it. And there was this belief by both people in prison and their advocates on the outside that we could do something fairer. Yeah. That if we had fixed prison terms,
right.
If you went in and you knew the exact day you were going to get out, that was going to be better than having even this crapshoot, to show how you've changed. And so, many people supported this. This also got picked up by the people on the right, who were against any form of release. But what happened was, this is really the tough on crime narrative that takes over, is that state legislatures who were setting these fixed terms, those terms just got longer and longer and longer, with more aspects of way to tack things on at the end once people get out, giving prosecutors way to add on for crimes, and these sentences just became longer and longer and longer. Mandatory minimums, truth in sentencing, 3 strikes. They all emerged from this moment of trying to figure out a different sentencing system other than indeterminate sentences, parole. And so for those advocates in the 70s, they were wrong in a lot. They were wrong. They hoped that this would be fair. And so we're at this moment now of how to battle this.
Yeah, and I'll say another consequence of that, of the tough on crime narratives, is community erosion, and also instilling fear into our communities. When we take single narratives, right, and we hold people as just inherently criminal, we're invisibilizing their families, right? When I look at a person, that's not just that person or the one act that they committed to land them in prison, right? I'm looking at a father, a brother, a mother, a sister, cousin, student, mentor, mentee. And the fact that media doesn't look at individuals with that type of lens, that once one person is locked away, this affects an entire community, we still get these like very short-sighted narratives. And this is what comes from credible news sources and then are internalized by the community, right? And so like we start to see each other with single narratives as well, knowing good and damn well that there are systems at play. There are reasons why people tend to gravitate towards what is more fear-based. It's like it's total psychology. And then what tends to piss me off is a thing called news judgment. Newsrooms don't have to, they decide what they cover. Of course they cover stories in the public interest, right? But they have the judgment to decide what they cover, meaning that these beat reporters don't have to cover crime all day long. Like neighborhood crime, shattered window crime, they do not have to cover that. Newsrooms can take into account full persons, their communities. You can have stories about communities. You can have stories about grassroots and advocacy efforts. You can have stories about the impacts of incarceration on families. You can have stories about parole board hearings, but those aren't the stories that we aren't getting, and no one is asking or demanding mainstream media, local news media, why.
Yeah.
And so so I believe change 100% starts at home. And one thing I tend to implore people is that if the media has shown, like mainstream media, that it cannot be trusted, and we have access to media with our phones. Anything we post up on social media is media. We are in an attention economy, which means newsrooms like Injustice Watch or local, like the Chicago Tribune, we are all in competition with each other. News is a market. We are all on the same timeline. If I can draw your eyes in for more than 5 minutes, then the other newsroom, we are winning, right? And so like, since we're all in this market, this competition with each other because of capitalism, right? That means we are also at war, well, not at war, but like in competition with influencers. When Illinois abolished cash bail, there was a big narrative, huge narrative, that they're going to let folks out of prison and it's going to be a purge happening all throughout Chicago. Hasn't happened yet. I haven't seen no purge. I haven't seen nothing of the sort. If you haven't seen the movie Purge, it's about, you know what?
All the things Donald Trump said is happening right now in the streets. Yeah.
Yeah, just all out brutality. I haven't seen it. And those influencers racked up millions of views. You can go on YouTube, just type purge law in the search bar. Racked up millions of views. People not even living in Illinois talking about it. And it hasn't happened. There are no consequences for those influencers who've put that narrative out. There are no consequences for the newsrooms that put those narratives out. Yet people have digested and internalized that. And now it's just out there.
So let's talk about solutions then. Let's talk about how to tell different stories or better stories. And maybe a place to start is to think about what we all experienced in here in the summer of 2020 and then beyond. Because that was a moment when, after George Floyd that summer, amidst COVID, when it felt like the opposite narrative was suddenly getting a toehold and really going mainstream, in a way that was powerful and for our lifetimes, totally unique. And to think of the possibilities that were going on, not just to fund the police, but to rethink the criminal justice system, and to also think that, I'll say even for white people and white people who are not just incredibly progressive, but even kind of just, middling liberal, to suddenly wrestle with ideas of privilege and racial inequality and how that's wrapped up in the criminal system and the policing system. It felt really powerful. And I know that I was sitting at parole hearings I was reporting during that time, and I thought I was writing a different kind of book. I thought I was writing a book about seeing the country change, because I saw parole board members, even ones who were tough on crime police officers their entire career, suddenly thinking about people who were convicted of violent offenses and thinking like, okay, I can see them differently. I need to move on from this. The world has changed and I need to catch up with it. And as we know, by the midterm elections in 2022, that was all erased. And we have Chesa Boudin here, who was the DA of San Francisco and got caught up in this backlash as well with a recall effort. The parole board that I was watching, every single member was removed. That, as somebody said earlier, we're a state with a supermajority of Democrats in the legislature and Democrats across the board, and there was no cover for any of this. We all got those mailers, if you remember, those fake newspapers that were coming in the mail from the Republican governor candidate, and like the tough on crime narrative came back, even though it was like the same tired old stories, and it worked. Like, that's what's incredible. There was nothing new about it. It felt like some retread of early 1990s, and we all here saw how powerful it was, that it could dominate again. And I wonder, even from your organizing, what do you see as lessons from that moment?
So I think that we all have to take the charge of amplifying, and this was said on the earlier panel, but amplifying the directly impacted and the most impacted from incarceration and these narratives. And I think we really have to amplify things that we are for. Rehabilitation, restoration, restorative justice. So these things won't die out in this mainstream media sphere. I think about when we were talking, when BYP 100, when we were doing the Say Her Name campaign, and we were organizing for Rekia Boyd, who was shot by police officer Dante Servin, and he was fired, and then, we organized to get him fired. But along the way, the narrative that we had to create and also amplify was that Rekia belonged to a family, belonged to a community. This was a cop who was drunk at the time, walked out on his front porch, fired at some loud black folks. Bullet caught Rekia in the head, and she died. And so we had to basically explain to people that story, the instance, but deeper than that, we would talk with Rekia's family and amplify the family. Yeah. Like her brother Martinez Sutton was a student at Chicago State University at the time. And he had to be a student while dealing with the death of his sister, which we know Chicago historically does not prosecute police officers for their crimes. Most cops get off. And this is the weight that this man and his family has to carry and has to fight through that time. And then not only that, we're combating the narratives of mainstream media, because what they did was listen to the police report or just amplified the police report. And people don't understand that the Chicago Police Department is a city agency, meaning that they have a communications and PR a division to their agency. So they're thinking about narratives all the time. The city agencies are thinking about narratives all the time. And so like we as advocates, activists, newsrooms have to also be thinking about narratives and what we're sharing out and what we're amplifying in terms of getting people free.
Yeah. And so I'd say that in the kind of long form writing I'm doing, which isn't as contingent on like the daily news cycle, that's exactly what I try to do, right? Like to tell a deeper story. Yeah. And so that it's harder to see people as abstractions or monsters, because you have to wrestle with their full humanity and the complexity. It's not ignoring some of those problems, but it's putting them in context. One of the like, there's like the allure of or the magic of parole is that people do get out occasionally. It's not a system of release, but there's these exceptional cases. And so you meet someone like Khalif here, and it's clear that he's a full human being, but there's still this story of him as Johnny Veal, this kid from 1970, that is so dominant. And, you know, so you have to like butt up against it, as you're saying. Let's talk about more solutions, because I'll add one and then another one, and then I want you to add more. But, you know, I think there's also something, you know, we're held to a different standard. And I was hearing this on the last panel, like we have to come up with solutions. And this was actually like, if anyone watched the presidential debate, like there's such a double standard of, you know, one candidate could just say everything is terrible or fantastic, and the other one is like held to, has to give us, you know, details of a plan. And you know, the question of like, so what are we doing? Mm-hmm. We actually are held to a different standard. Like someone could just say, be afraid, be afraid, be afraid. Mm-hmm. But we have to say like, okay, you can't just say defund the police mm-hmm. or decarcerate or let's bring parole back or end MSR. It's like we have to actually address that people are, you know, want safety. They need solutions, but they don't know anything else. Yeah. And so we actually have to, you know, it's unfair in many ways, but we have to be much more strategic and spell things out and actually develop ideas.
Most definitely. I would say, and you brought up defund the police, I think when I think about sloganeering, and when we put slogans out like that, of course, it was easy to pervert for the right and liberals as a way of saying, we want crime. Because that's what people hear when people say, like, we defund the police. Well, our jobs as those who are amplifying that slogan is to, like, get into our communities, have little workshops and whatnot, talk about restorative justice, talk about what people were actually saying in that moment. They were saying, let's defund or reallocate monies from the police department into the things that we want to see in terms of rehabilitation, in terms of restorative justice. We want more social services for our schools. We want more mental health. That message was lost because of the mainstream media. So one thing I say is, like, we have to expect mainstream media to do what it does, right? So therefore we have to turn internally, organize ourselves, different organizations, coalitions, and whatnot, and really get back to our communities in terms of storytelling. Storytelling. So last month, I went to the Brave Space Alliance. They're headed by a black trans woman named Shannon, and they were talking about how they shifted their practice of, like, organizing pre-2020 to now to doing more like direct service work. I asked Shannon, because most newsrooms don't ask black, queer, trans people, how do you get your news? So I asked, how do you get your news? She's like, well, the literacy rates for our community isn't as high, and, you know, a lot of us just get our news word of mouth. Storytelling. And we don't do that type of work, that type of intentional work of going to the most marginalized communities, impacted folks, and just simply asking them, what is the best way that we can get information to you? And if it's storytelling, what she meant by that is having someone come in and just talk and explain what's going on in the world right now. And if that's a trusted individual, we can take them and go. And for black folks, that's been historically proven, because when we've been shelled out of, like, the mainstream media, and for so long, you talked about, like, the civil rights movement, our main source of news was the church. People in the church and the pastor going up in the pulpit telling us about, like, what's happening, deacons talking about, like, you know, just that word of mouth of information. And we're getting back to that because there's so much misinformation online. So what I would propose for folks to do is really think about storytelling and being really intentional with communities, and then asking them, yo, can we come out and explain what defund the police mean? Can we come out and explain what restorative justice means? Simple, basic definitions and workshops. What I feel is, like, what people need to start building this type of cultural cohesion that can push back against a lot of these mainstream narratives.
Yeah. I mean, thank you for that. I feel like we're sometimes caught in between these poles of people saying we're the most exceptional country in the world and a total disaster, and it's a nightmare, the purge, and sort of to tell like rational, realistic stories within that, that is difficult sometimes. And one of the things that I feel like I'm constantly trying to do is just to say that the system that exists today is not, like what we do in the United States is not normal. Mm-hmm. It's extreme. And it's also not normal compared to the rest of the world. There are other wealthy countries, everyone that doesn't punish the way we do, and it's not a disaster on the streets. And it's also not normal for our own history. Yeah. So before when we only locked up a fifth of the people we do today, the country was not in chaos. And I think that's important for people to hear, that it's not just like some pie in the sky thing. It can exist. You can decarcerate. You can have different punitive systems. You can have alternatives to prison, or people can be released from prison and become productive members of society, and it's not a disaster. Like pointing to other models and to really show that this thing we're in, it's become so normalized. Yeah. I mean, when you talked about the media, but I don't, it's not just outside, it's inside. Yeah. I mean, we all now believe, we hear a life sentence, somebody got life, or a juvenile is going to be charged as an adult, and we don't really blink. That these sentences feel yeah, that's okay, now that's what we do, or that, the prison system is, we're at 30,000 today, and it's down from 49. We're like, oh, that seems really good. Yeah. But it used to be 5,000 in Illinois. And so, yeah, to think of it in context like that.
Yeah, and I think on a personal level, I think that's probably the most upsetting is that we do hold these things as normal. Like it's completely normal to say we think people belong in cages. Yeah, for a long time.
I did a talk like this with a progressive prosecutor, not Chesa, but and we sat up here the whole time talking just like this. Yeah. And that we're thinking about how to decarcerate, thinking about alternatives. And at the very end, this progressive prosecutor had been criticized locally by activists for wanting a longer prison sentence. And he told an audience just like this the story of the crime. Mm-hmm. And 2 minutes into it, he had everyone basically saying, lock those motherfuckers up forever. Like he told a story about 2 kids who killed another kid. And it was just, again, the visceral reaction. Yeah. And, that thing of that is terrible. And it's an exceptional crime. We can't make the exceptional become the rule in how we create laws. We also have to think of what that means, and for these kids, who are they going to be in 20 years? That they did do a terrible thing, but all logic disappeared. And it was just, again, the hammer.
Yeah. One thing I would also say is a potential solution, or something I encourage people to do, is also, you mentioned the United States is an exceptional case of punishment and whatnot. And I remember back in 2015, me and some others, we were protesting the International Association Chief of Police Conference, right? I didn't know before then that international, police chiefs around the country would gather for a conference, but it was not just national, it was international folks. So you had the top cop from Chicago talking to the top cop from Tel Aviv in the same room, and they sharing practices, sharing new technologies that are coming out and whatnot. And this was taking place at McCormick Place right here in Chicago. And so a group of activists, we went down, blocked it for a couple of seconds, got arrested. It was 66 activists arrested. But I bring that up because I think we need to be more imaginative in terms of how we address tough on crime paradigms. And sometimes I believe that calls for looking outside of the United States. If the people who are, like I said, if police departments are thinking about narratives all the time, why aren't we with the same force thinking about, or even looking to, other countries?
Yeah.
right? I think about the what's happening in Gaza right now, and comparing the narrative shift from the Arab Spring. Like, people care more nowadays, and so we have to examine what changed, right? And I think it is this amplification on social media. It is people starting to be in spaces with Palestinians and actually seeing the atrocities that are occurring. And so what that tells me is that can be duplicated within local matters and local fights, right? We have to, I think it's more like a question of willpower, like the brother said earlier, and intention, and where we put our focuses towards, like.
Yeah, I want to say one last thing, and then let's hear from some people here. But, you know, the other thing in both of our work of engaging stakeholders in this, so, you know, thinking about a wider community, which is what's happening today, and also foregrounding or putting forward or even stepping aside for stories of individuals who have experienced this, who are system impacted anyway, that those stories need to be amplified.
Right.
And I think, you know, they are the stories themselves. They embody the sort of puncturing of the myth of the monster narrative. Like, human beings are talking about their own cases, and the more and more we have that, the better.
Yeah, I agree. Let's take some questions.
Yeah. Go ahead. Why don't you go first? Yeah, we'll repeat it so everyone can hear if you just say it loud enough for us.
Okay. So I'm from California, and I actually get the honor of writing the stories of those incarcerated to submit to the parole board. So I kind of have two questions. One is, any tips or advice on how I can work with my local journalists and media to amplify stories to submit to the parole board? And the other one is, how comfortable are journalists or media companies with having their work they've done be submitted into evidence so that the parole board can review?
So the question was about, she works with, in California, writing narratives for the parole board. And then the question was about journalists, you know, how to tell better stories to the parole board, and then how do journalists feel about those stories being utilized. I know that for me, I feel great about it. I mean, I want these stories to be put forward and to be shared with the parole board. In my own decisions, like, I had to decide, like, what my role was as a journalist. Do I just, like, you know, not participate in the parole process that I've been observing? And I decided to participate because, you know, more information and a fuller picture is better. And I think any journalist should feel that way. You know, you can be objective, but you can also, you know, it's just the more information, and, you know, the board is mostly getting stories that are received, and in many cases from people who've never revisited the person inside. So it's usually from, you know, papers that have been passed down, documents from even, like, the court, you know, and the prosecution, the statement of facts, it's called, as if it's, like, you know, inviolable in truth. But those are without ever visiting the people again. So the more information, I think journalists are part of that process.
Yeah, and I would say, like, in organizing terms, you got to find your people. So, like, have great discernment of, like, which newsrooms will be more apt to share that story, because, or those narratives around parole boards or just parole period, because what we have seen is, like, that they don't, right? So one, I would definitely take in consideration independent journalists who have big followings, who tend to cover things like restorative justice, parole, or who are, like, on the left side of things. So definitely, like, find your people, and then, yeah, tell other people about, like, what you're doing, and kind of, like, yeah, I think share the fact that, like, you're doing something that newsrooms won't share, right? You're doing something that newsrooms won't share. And you have to kind of put, like, a target on them so people can start thinking critically about the news that they're receiving from those quote-unquote credible sources, so that we can have more people demanding that those stories, those parole narratives are shared. Because it's not, as you know, like, it's not a common thing in mainstream media. So one, find your people, and Two, I would definitely look at independent journalists and influencers with a great amount of reach and try to develop a relationship with them. Locally, if you stay in California, locally, definitely.
You had a question, you had your hand up there.
So, Kate Musa, community organizer for the Coalition to Incarcerate Illinois. So, I work here locally in Chicago. I was wondering if you guys had any boards that do this work primarily that y'all would advise me to work with or alongside?
Go ahead.
You said program to
To the parole.
PNAP, definitely.
Yeah, the question was like, what organizations here are doing this work with Parole? I mean, there's an organization called Parole, Illinois,
Most definitely.
founded
Parole,
by
Illinois.
people inside prison, and they're at the vanguard of that here, and working with people on the outside.
I want to say Illinois Justice Project, Illinois Prison Project.
Yeah. Yeah, there's no shortage. I mean, that's the kind of thing to ask around here, but there are all kinds of groups that are doing this work that are connected to the hearing today, to this gathering.
Yeah, you're definitely in the right place. We can link after this, and I can try to share your contacts with you.
Go ahead, bro.
So my name is Ryan. I work with the Just Future Project, elevating the voices of people in these post-sentence indefinite confinement schemes. These are schemes in which people are incarcerated after their release date indefinitely. They're predominantly people of color, predominantly queer, and largely, in fact entirely, due to their conviction, their kind of conviction, incredibly stigmatized. And this task of humanization, you guys mentioned the monster rhetoric. I deeply appreciated that, and it's very fascinating what you're talking about. But I find that idea of the monster is both pervasive outside, but also within the CLS reform movement. And so my question for you guys is, have you had any success encouraging people to be courageous in their advocacy, given that both editors and advocates within our movement are often hesitant and afraid to advocate for these most marginalized communities because of their crime conviction?
So the question was about the work that he does as people post-conviction, that they're still criminalized even post-release and sometimes can't even be released because you're saying they can't find a place to live and so on. Is that?
So the system I'm talking about, these are people that are sent to, it's a little bit complicated.
Yeah.
After their release date expires, they're sent to a post-carceral facility that the state pretends is a hospital.
Yes, yeah.
In fact, has no rehabilitative purpose. And in Moose Lake, the facility I'm most super familiar with, 23 of the 900 and some odd people who have been confined to this facility have been released in its 30-year history.
Yeah. And so,
This is not about rehabilitation.
and so your question ended up about us, whether our own biases and sort of failing in this way, like groups like this, that we're also falling prey to some of these stories. I think that.
My question is, I have found that people are afraid to share and elevate these stories due to the stigma around this crime of conviction. And as someone deeply interested in civil liberties, like everyone else in this room, I'm sort of wondering if you've had any success with strategies to encourage people to tell stories of marginalized voices like these people. There's a facility here in Illinois. I believe 34% of the people in this facility are black. Almost 50% are people of color. 20% are queer. And they're not going anywhere. They're sitting in this cell with less civil liberty protections than the regular justice system.
Yeah.
Just saying something. And so again, my question is, have you had any success activating people to advocate for things that go beyond nonviolent offenses, stuff like that?
Yeah, including sex crimes, which is the most stigmatized group. It's difficult. I mean, and so I think in a lot of many people here, when we think about reform movements and even passing legislation, this whole argument about like carve-outs, and whether we decide to have none, whether we sort of advocate for everybody, or we make these concessions. And we've all wrestled with this. and you can sort of stand firm and say, like, no, this law, whatever we're pushing for, what we're advocating for or lobbying for, it can't have any exceptions in the way that you're saying. And usually there are all these compromises in the language that you're saying.
Yeah, I think you're pointing out a key organizing issue across all lines, right? I think it's that internal battle of like pushing folks further human, I guess, and we're calling human radical nowadays. And the radicals, in my opinion, have always been of the minority. We're always in the minority. And so, like, I remember I was in an organization and we were fighting for, like, Rekia Boyd. These people weren't on abolition yet, but still, like, fighting for Rekia Boyd and the firing of Dante Servant. It was on punishing the cop for what he did. Let's try to remove his pay. Right? But the overarching goal of abolition, they wasn't there yet. And so we have to respect people's journey of becoming more human or radical, right? But what we cannot do is opt out and not try to have those conversations, those deep, eternal conversations within our organizations and communities. Like, we have to, like, those of us who think we know, like, of those of us who are saying, like, we need people to be free right now.
Yeah.
And then we got folks who we're working with who say, like, right now, I don't know. But if they're part of our campaign, part of our movement, we cannot leave them alone. We got to be that pesky bug in their damn ear. We have to, like, movie night at my house, I'm going to show y'all this abolitionist film, we're going to talk about some abolition. It doesn't even have to be like that. It could be more subtle, but the thing is, we cannot let people go.
Yeah.
And we have to understand people come to their own radicalization process, or like they meet a certain knowledge when they do. They were like 4 years ago, I was not good on pronouns at all. Like, didn't what, but and just because I wasn't there doesn't mean people didn't abandon me in terms of, like, learning. Like, Charles, you're not radical enough to fight for this thing, although we know the thing needs to end today. So that urgency will always be present as the system remains.
And I'd say it's the same paradigm that we're describing of, like, you can't let where people's fears and imaginations go, you can't let the most extreme version stand for the whole. So just, telling individual stories, normalizing, getting individuals to speak for themselves, sharing more stories over and over again. It feels like it's the same as with, everyone in the criminal justice system. I think we have time for one more question. You pick, go ahead, in the front.
Thank you. So I work with a group in Texas. We're formerly incarcerated women and gender expansive folks. And we understand the power of storytelling, right? Like, the more we're seen as not the monster, right? Like, to the, like you were talking about, the context and the complexity of our stories, that's when you start to see change, right? When they, it's a lot easier when they see you as fully human. And my question is, maybe you can give us some advice in terms of, like, the very communities that we know we need to go to change this narrative and this culture are often the most threatening and frightening. Rural parts of Texas where women of color and queer folks coming in talking about, criminal justice and their stories can feel very, very scary. So what is the advice for groups like ours to do that in that type of environment, and what things have you seen be most effective?
Do you want to talk about the organizing around ending cash bail? Because I found that to be, for here locally, I mean, the kind of legwork when I think we ended cash bail in Illinois, which, in a moment that seemed like it wouldn't happen, and the legwork that went into that of going into suburban communities and over again talking about what this meant and why it's not scary, and where else it actually has been done in other cities and states, and the District of Columbia, and what are potential consequences, and meeting people who got out of prison, or jail, and so on, like just the years of organizing that went into trying to build support. Amidst a lot of depressing things that happened in the state and the country, it was a really powerful win, and the result not just of like something immediate, but years of that kind of like legwork you're describing, of going places that seemed unfamiliar and a little scary, and finding partners, coalition partners in those areas, and having small talks, building them up. There is a little something like where we are today, where we're talking amongst ourselves, and this is less going out there and doing that. But it felt like, there are always these models of when the kind of thing we hope for actually works, and we have to elevate them and then think about why they worked and how we can replicate them.
Yeah, I totally agree with Ben. Going out into unfamiliar territory, communities that you believe you have to get certain things passed, it takes years upon years, committed people willing to have tough conversations, and then just general community building and friendship building, right? Those type of bonds. They may not come to what you believe tomorrow, but maybe a year from now, but they know that they have a relationship with someone who's been coming nonstop, saying that they do have power to change something. And that is more than like what we're given on the mainstream level, which is politicians coming every 4 years or every 2 years to give out our talking points, right? So like as an organizer, patience is definitely a virtue. And I would say that think of ways to invite people in and make them feel warm and welcome in a way, but also like have moments where they are challenged politically, and also expose them to like what they don't know. A lot of people just don't have the information and have been grown up in echo chambers or like little silo communities where they just do not know. Yeah. So like I think it's important to get folks, strangers who haven't met each other in a room, to discuss and hear life experiences, and then it becoming an educational space where people can remember where they had that first interaction of abolition from. Well, I've had this first interaction. I talked to this, I think for me, when I entered like the BLM movement, I come from Roseland, Wild 100 Chicago, so 115th Street. And
she's from Texas. You got to explain it.
Yeah. So like Chicago segregated, south side of Chicago, far south side of Chicago, right? So like it's like 30 minutes out, but still Chicago. And then I started organizing. I went into an organization that was black and queer led, right? I'm a cishet black man from Chicago. I get into an organization totally led by black queer women. Mind blown. Mind blown. Right? They're using terms I've never heard before. I'm saying things that I don't think I'm supposed to say or whatnot. But what kept me in those spaces was the comfort of like, I can mess up, I can make a mistake, and at the end of the day, we are all for liberation. There has to be an overarching theme to like connect us all. We all are human. We all are, right? And that comes with shifting the narrative. So like we have to paint a collective narrative, a collective vision, and having folks in the space being able to fail in conversation with folks they've never, with the strangers, right? And we can learn from each other. So, and sometimes it's not about people grasping what you have. Sometimes it's really all about trust. Like there's a lot of folks who vote for Donald Trump who don't believe Donald Trump. They trust him though. They believe. And we have to cultivate this sense of belief in our communities amongst each other. A sense of trust. Not that, oh, you're just coming here to get us to help sign a bill, right? We have to really humanize our approach to the people that we need as well.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'll just say that what's so unfair about a lot of this is there could be one crime, one event, and, you know, that's, you know, the kind of Willie Horton thing that everyone would grab hold of, and it can sort of, you know, erase years of progress. And it could be the idea that we have to buttress against that. We have to build and build against those moments because those are inevitable, and they can't take hold as the dominant story. Well, it's good talking with you.
Yeah, I think this was fun. I hope people learned something.
I learned something from, it's good meeting you in person.
Yeah, it's about time though. I've heard so much.
Yeah. Well, thank you, and you know, continue these conversations. Talk to one another. You know, it's essentially people are asking questions that are essentially answered in this room because, you know, the experts are all here, the people who've had the experience. So go around and talk amongst each other, and you know, get these answers or make the connections you need. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I get to talk. I should have looked down, so I definitely had it written down.